In a society where omegas are conditioned to yield, I was no exception. The expectation was clear: kneel before power. When the most formidable alpha king the world had ever known declared his intent to claim me, submission was not just anticipated, it was demanded. But my response, a single word spoken with quiet defiance, would unravel his pride, fracture his empire, and reshape my destiny. My name is Brena, and this is the tale of how my refusal forged a king. The air at the Blood-Moved Collective crackled with tension, thick with the mingling sense of pine and primal anticipation. It was an electric current humming through the atmosphere, resonating deep within Brena's chest and raising the fine hairs on her arms. She lingered in the shadows cast by a towering oak at the edge of the ceremonial clearing, her eyes scanning the restless crowd of alphas and betas. Their nervous energy pulsed like a storm, yet she yearned for invisibility, for obscurity. To be overlooked here meant safety. She was a whisper drowned out by roars, a fragile moonflower concealed beneath dense ferns. Silently, fervently, she prayed to the moon goddess to remain unseen. Then he appeared. Alpha King Drogo did not simply enter the clearing, he claimed it as though the earth itself bowed to his will. The cacophony of voices and restless movements did not merely fade, it collapsed into a hushed, reverent silence, crushed under the weight of his presence. His arrival carried a physical force, a wave of raw dominance that stole the breath from Brena's lungs and left her feeling impossibly small. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step deliberate and lethal. His broad shoulders and unyielding jawline spoke of the brutal strength that had subjugated countless rival packs. He embodied every legend told about him: magnificent, terrifying, absolute. Drogo ascended the ceremonial dais, his dark eyes sweeping over the gathered wolves with unnerving stillness. There was no warmth in his gaze, no trace of connection, only the cold calculation of a ruler assessing his domain. From the pack elder, he took the smooth obsidian claiming stone, its surface gleaming under the flickering torchlight like a shard of captured night. A ripple of anxiety coursed through the she-wolves, a volatile mix of fear and foolish hope. For an omega like Brena, there was no room for hope, only dread. To be claimed by anyone meant surrendering the quiet solitude she held dear. To be claimed by him felt like the erasure of her very soul. His piercing gaze continued its methodical sweep, dismissing face after face with almost dismissive brevity. Brena held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs as she pressed deeper into the shadows, willing herself to vanish, to become nothing more than a shadow the eye might overlook. But predators always find their prey. His eyes, sharp and cutting as shards of obsidian, pierced through the throng and locked onto hers. In that fleeting moment, the crackling fires, the whispering leaves, and the rhythmic breathing of the pack dissolved into an eerie void. All that remained was the king's unyielding gaze, a trap from which there was no escape. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp and sudden, as though the air itself had been pierced. It was the sound of Brena's world fracturing, her carefully maintained invisibility shattering into countless shards. A path cleaved through the sea of wolves, as if guided by some unseen force. Two of Drogo's sentinels emerged, their massive forms casting shadows that seemed to swallow the light. With faces like weathered stone, they moved to flank her. They did not touch her, but their towering presence weighed heavier than any command. Every fiber of Brena's being screamed at her to flee, to vanish into the forest's dark embrace. Yet her feet felt anchored, bound by the oppressive weight of her new reality. Summoning every ounce of willpower, she forced herself forward, each step an eternity. She moved from the comforting obscurity of the shadows into the unforgiving glare of the firelight. As she neared the ceremonial rise, she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet the collective stares of the hundreds gathered. Whispers swirled around her, sharp and biting, like the edge of a blade. She felt like prey cornered by predators, her pulse thundering in her ears. Stopping at the base of the rise, she finally lifted her head to look at him. Up close, the sheer intensity radiating from him was overwhelming. The faint lines etched around his mouth spoke of arrogance, while the cold confidence in his eyes hinted at a life untouched by challenge or refusal. He was every bit the monster of legend, a ruler forged in fire and fear, a master who demanded nothing less than absolute submission. Yet, for the briefest of moments, she saw something else beneath the surface, a flicker of raw emotion that transcended mere cruelty. It was a profound loneliness, a stark isolation that mirrored her own buried feelings. There was a tragic echo of a man who could be more, a leader capable of greatness if only he could silence the beast within. That fleeting glimpse did not ease her fear, but it hardened her resolve. It gave her the strength to stand firm, to refuse to break or bow. Drogo extended his hand, the obsidian stone resting heavy and ominous in his palm. It was both an offering and a demand, a final, unyielding decree. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for her inevitable surrender. He expected her to kneel, to bare her neck, to accept her fate as his possession. Brena looked at the stone, a symbol of bondage, then back to his face, a mask of tyranny. She opened her lips, and a single word spilled into the charged silence, soft yet piercing, cutting through the tension like a shard of glass. No. It was a whisper that carried the weight of defiance, reverberating across the clearing like a thunderclap. Drogo's hand froze mid-air. The collective shock of the pack surged toward Brena like a tidal wave, threatening to knock her off her feet. Yet she stood firm, her voice finding a fragile strength as she unleashed the venom of her resolve. I will not be claimed by a tyrant. Time seemed to freeze. The crackling bonfires and the rustling wind through the pines were the only sounds in a world that had forgotten how to breathe. Drogo's face, once a portrait of regal authority, now twisted into an expression of utter disbelief. His eyes, which moments before had radiated dominion over life and death, widened with a shock so profound it bordered on absurd. He stared at Brena as though she had transformed into something otherworldly, speaking words he could not comprehend. No, a word his mind refused to accept. The Alpha King, ruler of the Blood Moon Collective and conqueror of the Northern Territories, had been publicly denied by an Omega. Then the disbelief began to fracture. It splintered like ice under pressure, revealing the molten fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. A low growl rumbled from deep within his chest, primal and guttural, vibrating through the air like a seismic tremor. The atmosphere grew heavy, saturated with the electric charge of his impending wrath. His gaze shifted past Brena, sweeping across the sea of faces staring back at him. His warriors, elders, subjects. For the first time, he saw not their fear, but their astonishment. Their silent judgment pierced him like daggers. He, the alpha among alphas, had been humiliated, not by a rival's blade and glorious combat, but by an Omega's quiet defiance. Humiliation coiled around him like a venomous serpent, sinking its fangs into his soul. "What did you say?" he snarled, his voice sharp as a serrated blade, each syllable dripping with menace. Brena met his rage with a calm she didn't know she possessed. She didn't repeat herself. Her silence was answer enough. And in that silence, the last vestige of his control shattered. With a roar that shook the trees and sent birds fleeing into the night, he lunged, not at her, but at the ceremonial stone. Snatching it from the elder's grasp, he hurled it into the darkness of the forest. The symbol of his authority, rejected and discarded with violent force. His chest heaved, his eyes blazing with hatred hot enough to melt stone. "You dare," he bellowed, his voice reverberating through the clearing like a declaration of war. "You dare defy me. You are nothing. Leave my lands now, or my wolves will tear you apart. You are banished. If you are seen within our borders by sunrise, you will be hunted down and slaughtered like vermin." It was a desperate, frenzied attempt to reclaim the power she had so effortlessly stripped from him. The king's decree still rang in her ears as Brena fled, her survival instincts kicking in with a ferocity born of years spent slipping through life unnoticed. Without hesitation, she turned and ran, abandoning everything she had ever known. The forest swallowed her whole, its cold shadows wrapping around her like a second skin. Behind her, the life she once cherished burned to ashes with every pounding step she took. Branches clawed at her face, leaving stinging welts on her skin, while jagged rocks and hidden roots tore at her bare feet. Yet she felt none of it. Only the deafening rhythm of her heart and the imagined pursuit of unseen predators closing in. Every step was driven by primal fear, the kind that comes from knowing death might be just one misstep away. For days, she moved like a phantom, slipping through the trees under the cover of darkness. By day, she collapsed into whatever shelter she could find. Thorny bushes, shallow hollows carved into the earth, anywhere that promised even a fleeting sense of safety. Her body screamed for rest, but sleep came in broken fragments, interrupted by the slightest sound or movement. Hunger gnawed at her insides as she scavenged what little the forest offered. Bitter roots that tasted of dirt, sour berries that left her stomach churning. Shadows loomed large in her mind, twisting ordinary noises into threats. Every snapped twig seemed to herald the arrival of hunters. Every rustling leaf carried the promise of danger. Fear became her constant companion. An icy weight settled deep within her chest. But no hunters came. No jaws closed around her ankles. As the miles stretched behind her and the familiar sense of home faded into nothingness, something inside Brena began to shift. The terror that had propelled her forward began to harden, transforming into something sharper, more resilient. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was resolve. A quiet, unyielding determination took root in her soul, a shield against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. She had been an Omega, a creature defined by submission and invisibility. That version of herself had perished in the flames of the king's wrath. What remained was someone entirely new, a survivor, forged in the crucible of exile and desperation. The wilderness tested her relentlessly. Each day brought fresh trials, each night another battle against exhaustion and doubt. Brena grew thinner, her body marked by countless scrapes and bruises. Her clothes hung in tatters, stained with mud and sweat. The softness that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a weary toughness earned through sheer willpower. Yet, amidst the struggle, a spark of defiance flickered to life within her. This harsh existence, brutal and lonely though it was, felt freer than anything she'd ever known. Freedom, she realized, wasn't measured by comfort or ease. It was the ability to choose, even when those choices were painful. And she chose to live, not merely to survive, but to prove that her spirit could not be broken. Time blurred together, weeks bleeding into a month. The forest changed around her, its silver-laced trees whispering secrets she couldn't yet understand. Brena became part of the landscape, a ghost drifting silently between the ancient trunks. She learned to read the subtle signs of the wild, the way the wind carried scents, the patterns of animal tracks, the language of birdsong. These small victories gave her a fragile sense of control, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of adapting. Though loneliness clung to her like a second shadow, she refused to let it define her. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, the steady beat of her heart, the knowledge that she was no longer the same wolf who had fled in terror all those days ago. Brena's transformation was slow, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. She carried herself differently now, with a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Her eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now held a glimmer of something else, something harder, fiercer. She was no longer running from the past. She was walking toward a future of her own making. The scars on her body told stories of resilience, and the resolve in her heart whispered promises of revenge, not against the king necessarily, but against the idea that she was powerless. Somewhere deep in the forest, among the whispers of the silverwood, Brena found a truth that would sustain her. Freedom, however cruel, was worth infinitely more than the gilded cage she had escaped. The wilderness had taught her survival, the language of tracks left by small creatures, the secret of finding water that wouldn't poison her, and the art of sleeping within the curve of a fallen log to fend off the night's biting chill. Her journey led her into the Silverwood, a forest cloaked in dense mist, ancient and foreboding. The air carried an unfamiliar heaviness, thick with the scent of a foreign pack. She knew she was an intruder, a solitary wolf without a trace of belonging, treading on sacred ground. A persistent undercurrent of unease thrummed through her veins, but desperation finally overruled caution. Her throat burned with thirst. She stumbled upon a narrow stream, its waters gurgling softly as they wound through mossy rocks. Dropping to her knees, she cupped handfuls of the cool, crystalline liquid, savoring it like nothing she'd ever tasted. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over her, and her guard faltered. That was when the sharp crack of a twig shattered the stillness behind her. In an instant, she sprang to her feet, clutching a crude spear-like stick in trembling hands. Every muscle coiled for a fight she knew she couldn't win. 3 massive wolves emerged from the shadows, their silver-gray fur blending eerily with the dim twilight. They weren't from the Blood Moon Collective. Their scent spoke of damp earth and riverstone, homegrown but not hers. Circling her slowly, they bared rows of gleaming teeth. their low growls resonating like a death knell. This wasn't a challenge, it was a verdict. There would be no negotiation. Prodded forward by the largest wolf, she obeyed, each step weighed down by dread. Her heart felt like a stone sinking deeper into her chest. The procession led her to a sprawling encampment hidden within a secluded valley. Wolves paused mid-task to stare, their eyes filled with suspicion and open hostility. She was marched past them until she reached a central tent where a scarred alpha sat skinning a rabbit. A jagged mark ran down one side of his face, lending him an air of unyielding authority. His cold gaze swept over her disheveled form, lingering on her defiant yet exhausted expression. Brena met his stare head-on, steeling herself for what might come next, unaware that her fate, already so cruelly twisted, was about to take another unforeseen turn. Before the scarred leader of the Silver Creek Pack, Brena stood exposed, stripped bare by his piercing scrutiny. He didn't see a refugee seeking refuge. He saw a liability, a rogue who reeked of trouble and carried the faint, dangerous tang of royal wrath. The weight of judgment pressed down on her, compounded by the hostile stares of surrounding wolves. This is it, she thought, the culmination of her desperate escape. She had fled one tyrant, only to find herself at the mercy of wary neighbors who might tear her apart. Clutching her makeshift weapon tighter, she braced herself, vowing not to beg for mercy. Before the Alpha could deliver his verdict, a new figure emerged from beside his tent. Tall and lean, with a gentle face and warm hazel eyes devoid of the harsh calculation that marked his leader, he commanded attention. "Father," the wolf spoke, his voice calm and steady, easing the tension in the air like a soothing balm. "Let us hear her story before we decide." This was Lucian, the Alpha son and the Pax Beta. With quiet purpose, he stepped between Brena and the others, a subtle but powerful act of protection. The scarred Alpha grunted, reluctantly agreeing. Lucian turned to Brena, and for the first time in months, she felt seen. Not through the lens of contempt, pity, or desire, but with simple, open curiosity. "You are an outcast," he stated, not accusingly, but as a matter of fact. "Why?" Brena hesitated, the weight of her defiance heavy on her tongue. Sharing her truth carried risk, but in the quiet patience of his gaze, she found courage. She recounted the tale of the tyrant king's claim and the word that had sealed her fate. When she finished, a tense silence enveloped the camp. The Alpha's expression darkened, unwilling to provoke the wrath of a neighboring ruler. Yet Lucian's face softened into quiet admiration. "To defy an Alpha king is an act of immense bravery, not a crime," he declared, his voice unwavering. Turning back to his father, he continued, "She poses no threat to us. She is a survivor. I will take responsibility for her and offer her my protection." The Alpha studied his son for a long moment before giving a curt nod. The immediate danger had passed. Brena looked at Lucian, the man who had stood for her when no one else would, and felt the fragile beginnings of trust take root in her weary heart. For now, she was safe, all thanks to his compassion. In the oppressive grandeur of his castle, Drogo was haunted. Once a symbol of his unyielding power, the great stone halls now felt like a self-imposed prison. Silence was his tormentor. In its grip, he heard her voice, a phantom whisper reverberating off cold stone, repeating the word that had become his curse: tyrant. Brena was a ghost haunting every corridor, her defiant eyes staring back at him from every polished surface. He saw her in the flickering firelight, a shadow of the Omega he had so carelessly exiled, her condemnation clinging to him like a second skin he could not shed. The kingdom functioned as it always had. His subjects still bowed, but the foundations of his world had been fractured by a single, quiet no. Desperate to bury her memory, he threw himself into the brutal routines of his rule. He drilled his warriors until they collapsed, rode his fastest stallions to exhaustion, and drowned himself in wine night after night. Yet she remained, a persistent specter, immune to both his rage and his attempts at oblivion. One restless night, pacing before a large silver-gilded mirror, he stopped. The reflection staring back at him was unfamiliar, gaunt and hollow-eyed, a man consumed by guilt and regret. He clenched his fists, trying to banish the image, but it lingered, just as she did. Her absence was a void he could not fill, her defiance a wound that refused to heal. Every corner of his domain seemed to echo with her name, every shadow a reminder of what he had lost. Drogo's mind churned with memories of her final moments before him, the fire in her eyes, the steadiness of her voice as she defied him. It was a strength he hadn't anticipated, a challenge he couldn't crush. And now it haunted him. His throne, once a seat of invincible authority, felt colder than ever. The weight of his tyranny pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. He had built his empire on fear, but fear was a fragile foundation, crumbling under the weight of her quiet rebellion. In the solitude of his chambers, he poured another glass of wine, the liquid burning his throat as he drank. But even the alcohol could not dull the sharpness of her memory. She was everywhere, in the flicker of candlelight, in the rustle of silk curtains, in the faint creak of wooden floorboards. He was trapped in a labyrinth of his own making, with her ghost as his constant companion. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. His advisors noticed the change in him, the way his temper flared more quickly, the way his decisions grew erratic. They whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with unease. The mighty Drogo, once unshakable, was unraveling, yet none dared speak of it to his face. Fear kept them silent, though it no longer held the same power over him. He found himself drawn to the places she had once occupied, retracing her steps through the castle. The library where she had spent hours reading, the garden where she had walked beneath the stars, the balcony where she had stood gazing at the horizon, all bore the imprint of her presence. Each space felt emptier without her, a testament to what he had destroyed. And still she lingered. Her voice whispered in the wind, her laughter echoed in the silence, her defiance burned in his mind like a brand. He tried to convince himself it was weakness to feel this way, that a king should not undone by the absence of one woman. But the truth was undeniable. Her courage had exposed the fragility of his reign, and he could not escape the consequences of his actions. As dawn broke over the castle, painting the stone walls with pale light, Drogo stood alone in the great hall. The weight of his crown pressed heavily on his brow, a reminder of the power he clung to yet could no longer fully wield. Somewhere deep within him, buried beneath layers of pride and anger, he knew he had lost more than just Brena. He had lost a part of himself, and there was no path forward that could undo the damage he had wrought. He stood before the mirror, confronting his reflection for the first time since the claiming. His powerful frame filled the glass, the weight of the crown heavy on his head, and the familiar sneer of arrogance tugged at his lips. But beyond the surface, he saw what she had accused him of, cold, empty eyes that spoke of a man who ruled through fear because he lacked the strength to inspire loyalty. He was no king. He was the monster she had named him. The realization struck like a shard of ice piercing his chest, sharp and unrelenting. His conquests, his power, the trembling respect he commanded, it was all a fragile illusion, a monument to his own emptiness. He could break pacts and bend alphas to his will, yet he had crumbled under the quiet defiance of one Omega. He was a tyrant because he was hollow inside. The weight of this truth brought him to his knees on the cold stone floor, his self-loathing pressing down on him like a physical force. This was his true punishment, not exile, not the blade of a challenger, but the soul-deep reckoning with the man staring back at him in the mirror. Under Lucian's steady and compassionate care, Brena began to heal. Life within the Silver Creek pack became a soothing balm for her wounded spirit. There were no grand displays of dominance or ceremonies steeped in intimidation, only the gentle rhythm of a community working together in harmony. The she-wolves taught her which roots were safe to eat. The children showed her where to find sun-warmed river stones, and the hunters shared their kills freely without demanding tribute or submission. It was a life of simple contentment, far removed from the suffocating fear that had defined her days in the Blood Moon Collective. Her days found purpose in weaving warm blankets for the approaching winter and assisting the pack's healer in sorting herbs. Lucian remained her unwavering guardian, ensuring she always received the choicest cut of meat at meals and a spot by the warmest part of the fire. He walked beside her through the woods, his presence a comforting shield against the lingering stares of those who still viewed her with suspicion. He never pushed, never demanded. His kindness flowed like a gentle tide, slowly erasing the scars of her past trauma. With him, she felt truly seen, not as an Omega to be claimed or an outcast to be feared, but simply as Brena. Her shoulders, once perpetually tense in anticipation of conflict, began to relax. The haunted look in her eyes softened, replaced by a clear, gentle light. One afternoon, while mending a net by the creek, one of the younger wolves stumbled through a clumsy joke, and Brena laughed. The sound was genuine and unrestrained, bubbling up from deep within her, surprising them both. It felt unfamiliar, like a forgotten melody from a life long buried. She looked up to see Lucian watching her from across the clearing, a warm, pleased smile lighting his face. In that moment, surrounded by the peaceful hum of her new life and bathed in the warmth of his affection, she allowed herself to believe in healing, in belonging, in the possibility of something more. She began to hope that a life of quiet contentment, free from the burdens of power and control, might actually be within her reach. The idea was as frightening as it was beautiful, stirring emotions she had long kept buried. A familiar dispute arose once again, this time involving the Stone River Pack. The small but stubborn clan to the east had diverted a shared waterway to irrigate their struggling crops, leaving the Blood Moon Collective's outlying farms parched. It was an act of defiance, a direct challenge to authority. Drogo sat on his throne, the cold stone beneath his hands grounding him as he listened to the reports. His council, composed of hardened alphas with battle-worn faces, waited expectantly. They knew their king well. In the past, he would have already sent his fiercest warriors to retaliate, delivering a swift and brutal lesson in obedience. But as Drogo looked at the eager faces of his advisors, he felt only revulsion. This was the kingdom he had built, a place where violence was the default solution. He thought of Brena and the disdain in her voice when she called him a tyrant. Her words haunted him, etched into his soul like a brand. An attack would satisfy the primal urge for dominance, but it was not what he wanted anymore. He refused to let the old version of himself, the monster, dictate his actions. Taking a deep breath, he broke the heavy silence. "Send a messenger," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Tell them we will not send warriors. We will send engineers to help them build a proper irrigation system, one that benefits both our people and theirs." The stunned silence in the hall was deafening. His advisors stared at him, disbelief etched across their faces. Diplomacy and aid were foreign concepts to them, tools unworthy of their king. Yet in their shock, Drogo saw the first tangible sign of his transformation. The tyrant inside him was beginning to crumble, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. It was a small step, a crack in the armor of his rage, but it felt like the most significant victory of his reign. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on Brena's skin as she strolled along the creek with Lucian. This had become their ritual, a peaceful time at the end of each day to talk or simply exist together in comfortable silence. A sense of calm had settled over Brena, one she was learning to trust. She felt Lucian's hand slip into hers, his touch warm and reassuring. The gentle rhythm of the bubbling water and the rustling leaves created a serene backdrop, wrapping them in a cocoon of tranquility. For the first time in years, Brena allowed herself to believe that happiness wasn't just a fleeting illusion. It could be real, steady, and enduring. As they walked, she found herself reflecting on how far she had come since leaving behind the life that had nearly destroyed her. Each step forward felt lighter, as though the weight of her past was slowly lifting. Yadam, for the first time, she didn't pull away from a man's touch. Instead, she leaned into it, allowing herself this small comfort. It was a serene moment, a testament to the new life she was building, a life she owed largely to the gentle companion walking beside her. As they turned a corner, they encountered another member of the pack, Kale, a young hunter known for his kindness and friendly demeanor. He greeted them with a wide, respectful smile. "Brena," he said, his voice warm and cheerful, "the healer asked me to thank you. The willow bark you gathered is perfect." Brena returned his smile, her expression genuine and warm. "Thank you for telling me, Kale." The exchange was simple, an ordinary moment of camaraderie within the pack. Yet, Brena felt the atmosphere shift instantly. Lucian's hand, which had been resting gently on hers, tightened. It wasn't painful, but the sudden pressure was unmistakable, a gesture of possession. She looked up at him. His smile remained in place, though it now seemed strained, no longer reaching his eyes, which had grown cold as they fixed on Kale. "We were having a private walk," Lucian said smoothly, his tone carrying an undercurrent of steel that caused Kale's smile to falter. The young hunter nodded quickly and hurried off. In an instant, the moment passed. Lucian's grip relaxed, his smile softened, and he resumed their conversation as if nothing had happened. But Brena couldn't shake the chill that had settled over her. That brief, possessive grip and the coldness in his eyes were deeply unsettling echoes of the dominance she had worked so hard to escape. A shadow had fallen over her peaceful world, and for the first time, she questioned whether she was truly as free as she had believed. The grand stone halls of the castle, once a source of immense pride, now felt less like a fortress and more like an echoing, opulent tomb. Shadows in the long corridors twisted into familiar forms, and every gust of wind through the parapets seemed to whisper the word that haunted him: tyrant. The title clung to him like a suffocating shroud, its weight unbearable. The crown atop his brow felt heavier than ever, not with the burden of leadership, but with the sharp sting of guilt for his past cruelty. For weeks, he had isolated himself, wrestling with the memory of Brena's judgment. In a fit of rage, he had shattered his claiming stone. But it was her single word that had shattered his entire sense of self. Amidst the ruins of his pride, a painful, unfamiliar conscience began to grow, demanding penance he didn't know how to give. He started his journey toward redemption not with grand gestures, but with quiet, deliberate steps into parts of his kingdom he had always ignored. Trading his royal finery for the unmarked leathers of a common hunter, he exchanged his crown for the anonymity of a deep hood. Each step took him further from the gilded cage of his throne room and closer to the people whose lives he had overlooked. The first time he wandered through the narrow, muddy alleys of the lower citadel, an oppressive silence descended, thick with fear. People scattered, mothers hurriedly pulling their children into doorways. The memory of his explosive anger still lingered like a fresh wound in the collective psyche of the populace. But this time, he neither shouted nor issued commands. Instead, he listened. He approached the blacksmith, whose forge he had once threatened to destroy over a delayed shipment of spearheads, and quietly inquired about the health of the man's ailing son. His voice was subdued, stripped of its usual arrogance. He visited the weaver's den, a place he'd only ever known as a name on a tax ledger, and sat with the elders as they spoke of dwindling resources and the harsh levies he had imposed. He absorbed their grievances, their quiet despair, and for the first time, he saw them not as subjects to be controlled, but as people he had profoundly failed. Over days, their ingrained suspicion began to soften into cautious curiosity. He ordered the royal granaries opened, distributing food not as a king's largesse, but as a silent apology for years of neglect. In council meetings, to the astonishment of his advisors, he tore up the predatory agreements he had forged with neighboring territories, replacing them with treaties of mutual support and shared borders. With each decree, with every humble conversation, he dismantled the reign of fear he had so meticulously built. His guards watched him with confusion, his advisors with shock. They assumed his reforms were politically motivated, but Drogo knew the truth ran deeper. He was reconstructing his soul, piece by painful piece, driven by the haunting memory of an Omega who had forced him to confront the monster within himself. Yet he understood with chilling clarity that none of it would matter if he never had the chance to tell her. The Silver Creek Pact stood in stark contrast to the life Brena had fled, a haven, a verdant dream after a long and brutal nightmare. The air was pure, the wolves gentle, and the constant undercurrent of fear that had been her companion for so long finally receded. Under Lucian's patient and unwavering care, she began to heal. The haunted look in her eyes gradually gave way to a quiet contentment, and laughter, once a distant, forgotten act, returned to her. Lucian was the architect of this newfound peace. Attentive, kind, and fiercely protective, he anticipated her needs before she could even articulate them. He brought her the sweetest berries from the sunniest bushes and the softest pelts for her bedding. In every way, he was the opposite of the tyrant she had escaped. Yet beneath the surface of their idyllic harmony, a faint dissonance began to emerge, a note so subtle she tried desperately to ignore it. Despite Lucian's kindness, there was something intangible missing, a quiet yearning that lingered unspoken. It wasn't dissatisfaction exactly, but rather a shadow of doubt that whispered in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to think too deeply. She told herself it was gratitude she felt and relief at her safety, But the unease persisted, gnawing at the edges of her peace. It started with tiny signs, so subtle she almost convinced herself they weren't real. During light-hearted conversations with other unmated males in the pack, Lucian would materialize at her side. His arms would wrap possessively around her waist, his smile unwavering, but his eyes turning cold and hard like river stones for just a fleeting moment. He praised her beauty, the elegance of her movements, and the musicality of her laughter. Yet, when she offered practical advice on strengthening the camp's defenses during a communal meal, he'd chuckle softly and brush it aside with gentle condescension. "Leave the worrying to the alphas, my dear," he'd say. He encouraged her weaving, deeming it a suitably feminine skill, but outright discouraged her from joining the hunting party's training exercises, claiming it was too dangerous for someone as delicate as her. His kindness was slowly constructing an invisible wall around her, isolating her under the guise of protection. One evening, he presented her with a stunning necklace made of polished, iridescent river stones. As he fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin, he murmured, "So everyone knows you belong to me." The words were intended to comfort, a pledge of his unyielding protection, but they felt like cold, heavy shackles against her skin. She looked out at the serene valley, at the life she had nearly convinced herself was a dream come true, and suddenly saw the truth with devastating clarity. Lucian's affection wasn't a shelter, it was a cage. A softer, prettier cage than the one Drogo had offered, adorned with kindness and reassuring words, but a cage nonetheless. With growing horror, she realized she hadn't escaped her fate. She had merely traded one form of control for another. The world beyond the sheltered, misty valley of the Silver Creek Pack seemed like a distant rumor, a tale whispered by others around a crackling fire. Brena's life had contracted to the rhythms of the camp and the boundaries of Lucian's ever-watchful gaze. Yet the outside world had a way of creeping in, seeping through the cracks of her gilded prison. Traveling merchants, their carts brimming with goods and even more valuable gossip, occasionally passed through on their way to the coast. Brena found herself lingering near the fire, a quiet shadow absorbing their stories. They spoke of skirmishes in the southern territories and prolonged droughts in the east. But the tales that stole her breath, that made her heart race, came from the north, the lands she once called home. They spoke of the Blood Moon Collective and with bewildered awe of King Drogo. At first, she refused to believe them. These stories unsettled her, stirring memories she had tried to bury. The merchants painted a picture of Drogo that conflicted with the tyrant she had fled. They described him as changed, speaking of reforms and alliances he had forged. Some claimed he had become a fair ruler, though still formidable. Others whispered of a melancholy that clung to him, as if he carried an unspoken regret. Each story gnawed at her, forcing her to confront questions she had avoided. Had she misjudged him, or was this merely a new tactic to extend his influence? Brena wrestled with these thoughts in silence, unsure whom to trust. Lucian noticed her distraction and grew more insistent, his protectiveness tightening its grip. He urged her to focus on their life together, to let go of the past, but the past refused to release her. The traveler's tales lingered in her mind, mingling with her own memories, until she could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. Her days became a blur of conflicting emotions, gratitude for Lucian's care, frustration at his restrictions, and a yearning for something she couldn't name. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered to the edge of the camp. The moon hung low, casting a silvery glow over the valley. She touched the riverstone necklace, now feeling heavier than ever, and wondered if escape was possible, or if freedom was merely an illusion. The walls of her cage might be gilded, but they were walls all the same. And yet, beyond those walls lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps the chance to reclaim herself. The choice loomed before her, daunting and inevitable. The merchants, convinced they were being deceived, shared fantastical stories of a king who wandered among his subjects in the grimy lower districts. They described him listening intently to the grievances of the lowliest individuals as though they were matters of utmost importance. Tales spread of harsh laws abolished in a single night, and age-old feuds resolved not through violence, but through fair mediation. They spoke of a ruler who was calm, just, and possessed an almost unsettling wisdom. "He is not the same man from a season ago," one weathered fur trader remarked, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's as if his fury has been carved out of him." Others claimed, "He now rules with a quiet strength," some say a sorrowful one, as though he shoulders an immense weight. Brena retreated into the woods after hearing these accounts, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. It couldn't be real. It had to be a ruse, a ploy to lure enemies into complacency before a brutal strike. Yet the consistency of the stories gnawed at her. Every traveler, scout, and messenger brought another piece of the same baffling puzzle. Could someone like Drogo, a creature driven by raw instinct, truly transformed so profoundly? The tyrant she had defied was a tempest of wrath and arrogance. But the king they described sounded more like the fleeting glimpse of potential she'd seen in his eyes that fateful night, the lonely, isolated figure capable of greatness. A fragile, treacherous hope began to sprout in the desolate landscape of her heart, a delicate green shoot pushing through the ashes of her past. She found herself gazing northward more often, her eyes fixed on the horizon, torn between fear and yearning. Was it possible that the monster who had shattered her was somehow piecing himself and his entire kingdom back together? Lucian was no fool. He observed the subtle yet undeniable change in Brena. He noticed how her gaze would drift when she thought he wasn't watching, her smiles no longer reaching her eyes. He saw her relentless, almost frantic questioning of travelers and the restless energy coursing beneath her skin like a caged bird desperate to escape. He sensed her withdrawing, retreating into a realm of memories and turmoil where he could not follow. His response was born of possessiveness, which he mistook for love. To him, her inner conflict seemed like uncertainty, her longing for a life lost, merely a craving for security. His solution was not to understand her, but to tether her to him, binding her so tightly and publicly that she would never consider leaving. He resolved to formalize their assumed bond into an unbreakable pact. The moment came during the pact's tranquil evening meal under the soft silver glow of a rising full moon. The atmosphere buzzed with peaceful camaraderie, the pack content and at ease with the world around them. Lucian rose to his feet, the sharp tap of his knife against a stone cup slicing through the air. The gathered wolves fell silent, their attention snapping toward him like a magnet. Brena, seated beside him, felt an icy premonition coil in her stomach, tightening with each passing second. His smile was wide, confident, and meant for all, yet it bore down on her with unsettling intensity. "My friends," he declared, his voice resonating with pride that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. "For many weeks now, we have been graced by Brena's presence. She has illuminated our home and brought even greater warmth to my heart. It is time to make her one of us forever." I will proudly claim her as my mate at the next full moon." The room erupted in jubilant howls and cheers. Paws slapped Lucian's back in celebration, while she-wolves swarmed around Brena, pulling her into embraces and showering her with congratulations. Yet, instead of joy, she felt trapped, crushed beneath layers of expectations she hadn't asked for. Her face stretched into a brittle smile, fragile as porcelain, threatening to shatter under the weight of their enthusiasm. Over the sea of celebrating bodies, her gaze locked with Lucian's. His triumphant grin spoke volumes. It wasn't affection or partnership reflected there, but possession, as if she were a prize finally secured. There was no love, no acknowledgement of her journey, only the cold satisfaction of ownership. The golden bars of her cage had closed around her with finality, sealing her fate. Elsewhere, far from the clamor of wolves, a kingdom breathed easier. Fields stretched green and peaceful, markets bustled with life, and the oppressive fear that once choked its people had begun to loosen its grip. Drogo, the king, had done everything expected of him. He rebuilt what he had destroyed, listened when voices whispered truths, and ruled with fairness and resolve. By every measure, he had become the ruler Brena's defiance had demanded. And yet, despite outward appearances, his soul remained restless, barren, and haunted. The memory of her terrified eyes as she fled into the unforgiving forest lingered like a ghost, refusing to fade. Deep within him, he knew true redemption lay beyond the borders of his lands. It could not be found in repaired walls or restored trust. It required seeking out the woman he had wronged and earning forgiveness. His advisors pleaded with him to stay, their faces etched with worry. "You cannot leave, Your Majesty," implored his chief elder, desperation lacing his tone. "The stability of this realm rests on your presence. To abandon it now would invite chaos." But they didn't understand. The peace he had crafted felt hollow, a beautiful facade masking deeper unrest. True penance called for more than rebuilding. He needed to confront the pain he had caused. Standing before his council, Drogo steeled himself for the path ahead. No longer the tyrant who commanded, but the leader who explained. "My brother Kale will rule in my stead," he declared, his voice quiet yet resolute, carrying an authority that no longer relied on fury. "I must undertake a journey. This is not a matter of the crown, but a debt owed by my own soul." He packed no royal guard, no fine provisions, no banner of kingship. At dawn, he slipped from the castle, a solitary figure vanishing into the morning mist, clad in the worn leathers of a common hunter. His only companions were a water skin, a well-honed knife, and the unyielding weight of his regret. He had no destination, no map to guide him. Only scattered whispers from travelers lingered in his mind. The faint trail of an outcast Omega who had disappeared months ago into the wilderness. He wasn't searching for a mate to claim. That arrogant king had died the night of the claiming ceremony. Instead, he sought a woman to whom he owed an apology so profound it eluded words. He needed to find Brena, not to bring her back, but to look her in the eye, confess his sins, and tell her she was utterly free from the monster he had once been. Only then, he believed, could his torment begin to fade. The moon, a sliver shy of full, hung in the night sky like a judge's sickle, a celestial reminder that Brena's time was running out. From the entrance of her tent, a dwelling far more comfortable and spacious than any she had ever known, she watched the Silver Creek pack prepare for the celebration. Laughter echoed through the valley, carried on the crisp evening air. They were celebrating her, celebrating the final sealing of her fate. The joy around her felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest, threatening to crush her. Lucian had given her this tent, just as he had provided the softest pelts and the warmest spot by the fire. Every comfort was a thread in a silken net, drawing tighter around her, gentle yet inescapable. She retreated inside, the scent of dried herbs and pine filling her senses. This life was safe. It was a life without the gnawing hunger of exile or the constant fear of being hunted. Lucian was kind, attentive, and admired by his pack. Any she-wolf would consider herself fortunate to be his mate. But Brena saw the truth beneath his gentle affection. It was the kindness of a zookeeper toward a prized exhibit. He cherished her beauty, but dismissed her mind. He protected her body, but sought to contain her spirit. She thought of the cold flash in his eyes when another male spoke to her, the subtle way he steered her away from activities he deemed too rough, the patronizing smile he gave when dismissing her opinions. She was not his partner. She was his most precious possession. He ruled with a velvet touch, yet it was control all the same. Beneath his care lay a cage, gilded and warm, but a cage nonetheless. And though the world outside had been harsh and unforgiving, at least it had been hers. Here, among the laughter and festivities, she felt the walls closing in, suffocating her independence, erasing her identity piece by piece. The pack celebrated her as if she were a treasure won, their joy oblivious to the storm raging within her. She wanted to scream, to tear free of the silken bonds, but instead she sat in silence, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the firelight. Her heart ached with the knowledge that tomorrow would seal her fate, binding her to a life where freedom was an illusion and love was a gilded chain. And so, as the night deepened and the revelry continued outside, Brena wrestled with the truth she could no longer deny. The man who claimed to love her was, in fact, her keeper. Her thoughts unwillingly wandered north to the king she once knew. The murmurs of his transformation lingered like an unsettling echo in her mind. Had he really changed? The question was perilous, a labyrinth of what-ifs. Yet, as she pondered, the irony of her situation struck her with clarity. She had turned away from Drogo, not out of fear of cruelty, but because he sought to strip her of her autonomy through dominance and fear. Now, on the brink of another life-altering decision, she faced the prospect of surrendering that same autonomy to Lucian, who cloaked his control in kindness. She had endured the wrath of a king and the merciless wilds, emerging resourceful, resilient, and unyielding. Was she truly prepared to exchange that hard-won strength for a life of quiet, compliant submission? The realization hit her like icy water, jolting her from despair. No, she would not trade one form of captivity for another. She didn't yet know how, but she resolved not to let this claiming take place. The fire crackled softly, casting defiant warmth against the sprawling, indifferent darkness of the northern woods. Drogo sat by the flames, his traveler's garb of rough leather a stark contrast to the opulent silks and furs of his former castle. Weeks of relentless travel had stripped him of the excesses of royal life, leaving behind only the lean, hardened frame of a man driven by a singular purpose. Each day was a battle against the dwindling hope of ever finding her. He followed whispers, faint rumors of a legend about an outcast Omega who had defied a king. He chased shadows, and the loneliness of his quest gnawed at him like a constant ache. He was a king without a kingdom, A wolf without a pack, a soul adrift. That night, fortune shifted. Two fur traders, their faces carved by wind and eyes sharp with the cunning of their trade, approached his fire. Drogo, no longer the arrogant ruler demanding fealty, welcomed them with a nod and shared the roasted rabbit he had prepared. They spoke of trade routes, territorial disputes, and news from distant packs. One mentioned a grand celebration brewing in the Silver Creek pack. The alpha son, Lucian, is claiming a mate tomorrow night, he said, chewing thoughtfully. An outcast Omega, they say, a real beauty, but strange. No scent on her, and a past she doesn't speak of. The piece of meat slipped from Drogo's fingers, his hand trembling. An outcast Omega? Silver Creek. The fragments collided in his mind with the force of a thunderclap. It had to be her. The vast, trackless wilderness suddenly sharpened into focus, terrifying in its clarity. He was no longer merely searching. He was racing against time. He rose suddenly, his unexpected motion jolting the traders. The fatigue that had seeped into his very bones was consumed by a sharp surge of adrenaline. "Thank you for the news," he muttered, his voice low and urgent. With swift movements, he kicked dirt over the fire, smothering the flames. Rest and caution were luxuries he couldn't afford now. The traders exchanged bewildered glances as the intense hunter secured his pack and turned southward, his eyes gleaming faintly with a predatory light in the dimness. He began to run, his powerful strides devouring the shadowy ground. The scent carried on the wind now, a trail he could not ignore. He refused to be too late. He had to make it. The morning of the claiming ceremony arrived bright and clear, the sky an unbroken expanse of vivid blue. In the Silver Creek camp, the air buzzed with festive energy, a cheerful hum of anticipation rippling through the group. Yet for Brena, there was no joy, no excitement, only the suffocating weight of dread. She remained secluded in her tent, an unwilling participant in what felt more like a funeral for her freedom than a celebration. Outside, the pack thrived with merriment, but inside, Brena's mind churned with resolve. Her desperation from the previous night had crystallized into a cold, calculated plan. She would fake illness just before the ceremony, create chaos, and slip away into the woods under the cover of confusion. It was a fragile, last-ditch hope, but it was all she had left. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley, a ripple of unease disrupted the celebratory mood. A low, guttural howl echoed from the border sentinels, not a cry of alarm, but one of deep uncertainty. A foreign scent lingered in the air, one that did not belong. It was unmistakably the scent of an alpha, yet one radiating such overwhelming power and dominance that every wolf in the valley tensed instinctively, their hackles rising. It was the scent of a king. The Silver Creek Alpha, his scarred face grim, immediately began organizing his warriors, fearing a territorial challenge on this critical day. "Lucian," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "Take 5 of our best, go to the northern ridge, find out who dares approach my lands today." Lucian, clad in his finest ceremonial leathers, swelled with pride. On the day he was to claim his mate, he was being entrusted with confronting a potential challenger, an opportunity to showcase his strength and authority before the entire pack, especially Brena. His confidence brimming, he gathered his warriors and strode toward Brena's tent, pulling back the flap without hesitation. "There's a rogue at the border," he declared, his chest puffed out, Do not worry, I will handle this intruder quickly and return for our ceremony. He didn't wait for her response, striding off as a warrior ready to defend his territory. Lucian and his companions moved swiftly toward the ridge, the powerful scent growing stronger with each step. Beneath the towering ancient pines stood a solitary figure, radiating an aura of quiet exhaustion. It was not an intruder, but King Drogo himself, his appearance more akin to that of a burdened wanderer than a triumphant ruler. Lucian's initial smirk faltered, dissolving into a mixture of disbelief and possessive fury as his gaze locked onto the unexpected presence. The ceremonial fire blazed fiercely, its flames clawing at the darkening heavens. The Silver Creek patch had gathered in a tight circle, their faces glowing with excitement and anticipation. Yet for Brena, the scene felt suffocating, like walls closing in. Her carefully laid plans had unraveled. When Lucian returned from the border, he carried with him a storm of barely contained anger. He refused to divulge the identity of the visitor, dismissing it as a lone wolf he had driven away. But his wild eyes betrayed him, and his grip on Brena's arm was bruising as he dragged her toward the fire. "We will do this now," he snarled, all pretense of gentleness stripped away. "You are mine. No one will take you from me." Now she stood before the Alpha, Lucian's hand clamped tightly around her wrist like a shackle. The ceremony commenced, the Alpha's deep voice resonating through the sacred rites. Words of loyalty, strength, and the unbreakable bond between mates filled the air, each syllable burying her freedom deeper beneath layers of inevitability. Brena felt herself drift away, her mind detaching as though she were a ghost hovering above the scene, watching her own tragic fate unfold. The Alpha turned to his son, pride swelling in his voice. "Lucian of the Silver Creek, do you claim this she-wolf to protect and provide for her? To bind your spirit to hers for all your days?" Lucian's response came as a guttural growl of triumph. "I do." He released her wrist only to seize the back of her neck, his thumb pressing firmly against her skin, ready to pull her forward for the claiming bite. The Alpha's kind gaze shifted to Brena. "Do you accept this claim?" he asked, his tone expectant. "Do you choose to bind yourself to him?" Before she could respond, a voice cut through the clearing, not with the force of a roar, but with the weight of command tempered by regret. Every head turned in stunned unison. Emerging from the shadows beyond the firelight was King Drogo. His frame was thinner, his face lined with the toll of a long and arduous journey. Yet his presence commanded attention like a force of nature. His eyes, brimming with sorrow and desperate hope, were fixed solely on Brena. The celebratory atmosphere shattered. The air crackled with tension, charged not with joy, but with the promise of an impossible confrontation. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a vacuum of shocked silence. Then the spell broke, and chaos began to ripple through the gathering. Drogo stepped forward, his movements deliberate. His voice, steady yet heavy with emotion, carried across the clearing. "Brena," he began, his words piercing through the stillness, "this is not your path. You deserve more than captivity, more than a life bound by fear and obligation." His plea hung in the air, raw and unyielding, as the weight of his presence pressed against the hostility emanating from Lucian and the pack. Lucian's reaction was immediate and visceral. A low, feral snarl erupted from his throat, his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. "You dare interrupt this ceremony," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You have no right here, old man." Drogo did not flinch. Instead, he met Lucian's glare with unwavering resolve. "I have every right," he countered, his tone firm. "Brena is not a prize to be claimed or a possession to be owned. She is a person deserving of choice and freedom." The tension between them was palpable, a volatile mix of dominance and desperation. The pack members exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier joy replaced by uncertainty. Even the Alpha seemed momentarily at a loss, his authority challenged by the unexpected turn of events. Brena, caught in the eye of the storm, felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Drogo's words resonated deeply, stirring emotions she had long buried. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she was not shackled to a life dictated by others' desires. But the moment of clarity was fleeting. Lucian's rage boiled over, and he lunged forward, his intent clear. Drogo, however, was prepared. With the grace and strength of a seasoned warrior, he intercepted the attack, his movements precise and calculated. The clash between them sent shock waves through the clearing, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows that danced like specters. As the confrontation unfolded, Brena realized she had a choice to make. She could remain a passive observer, allowing others to dictate her fate, or she could seize control of her destiny. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped back from the chaos, her heart pounding with determination. This was her story, and she would no longer let it be written by anyone else. Lucian was the first to recover, his face contorting in a snarl of possessive fury. "You have no right," he roared, shoving Brena behind him as if she were a fragile object in need of protection. "Leave our lands, tyrant." The warriors of Silver Creek began to move closer, their hands gripping their weapons, their expressions wavering between fear and aggression. The tension crackled like dry tinder, threatening to ignite into chaos at any moment. Yet Drogo seemed utterly unfazed by the impending danger. He paid no heed to the glares of the warriors or Lucian's furious posturing. His entire focus had narrowed down to one person, Brena. With slow, deliberate steps, Drogo moved forward, his palms open at his sides in a gesture of peace, almost of surrender. "I am not here for you, Lucian," he said, his voice calm and steady, slicing through the mounting tension like a blade. His gaze never wavered from Brena's, an unspoken dialogue passing between them over the heads of the hostile crowd. "I am here for her." Each step he took created an invisible barrier around them, carving out a sacred space in the heart of hostility. When he stopped just a few feet away, his broad shoulders sagged with a weariness that seemed to emanate not from physical exhaustion, but from deep within his soul. He appeared broken, yet in his vulnerability lay a strength far greater than any tyrannical command he had once wielded. "Brena," he began, his voice raw and stripped of its former authority, "I am here to apologize." The words fell like stones into still water, silencing every sound in the clearing. "You were right. I was a tyrant, a monster who ruled through fear because I lacked the courage to rule any other way. I banished you, not because of your defiance, but because your bravery exposed my cowardice. There is no justification for what I did, for the pain I inflicted, for the terror you endured. I am sorry." His apology was more than mere words. It was a confession, a baring of his soul before both packs. He sought no absolution, offering only his shame as penance. Then, drawing a deep breath, he looked at her, his eyes pleading. I've changed because you made me change, and now, humbly, I ask for a second chance. I, Drogo of the Blood Moon Collective, wish to claim you as my mate, if you'll have me. He didn't command, he didn't demand, he simply asked, laying down his crown, his pride, and his heart at her feet. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath as all eyes turned to Brena, waiting for her response. But the fragile calm shattered when Lucian snapped. Drogo's plea, so raw and devoid of arrogance, hung heavy in the charged air. For a fleeting moment, time itself seemed suspended. Both packs stood frozen, witnessing the unfolding drama. Then the spell broke. Lucian, who had been immobilized by shock, finally erupted. His face, which moments ago had worn an expression of gentle concern, twisted into a mask of pure, unrestrained fury. The carefully cultivated kindness dissolved in an instant, revealing the possessive, raging beast beneath. This was no longer the quiet disappointment of a rejected lover. It was something darker, uglier, and far more dangerous. The burning fury of a collector consumed him as he watched another address his most prized possession. She is mine, he bellowed, the words raw and guttural, tearing from his throat like a primal scream. He lunged, not at Drogo, but at Brena, his hand shooting out to seize her arm, to physically yank her back behind him. It was a crude, instinctual act of ownership, a desperate bid to reclaim control over what he saw as his property. But before his fingers could even graze her sleeve, Drogo moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't strike, he didn't draw a weapon, he simply positioned himself between them, an immovable shield. His back was turned to Lucian, every ounce of his focus on protecting Brena from the man who had sworn to keep her safe. The silent defense stung Lucian more deeply than any physical blow. It dismissed him as inconsequential, a child throwing a tantrum. Completely unhinged by the public disgrace, Lucian lost the last shreds of his composure. With a feral howl, he hurled himself at Drogo's back. "I'll kill you, tyrant," he screamed, his attack wild and fueled by blind rage rather than skill. It was pitiful. Drogo didn't even fully turn. He merely shifted his weight, catching Lucian's flailing arm and using the momentum to spin him around and sent him stumbling into the dirt. Not a single punch was thrown, yet the fight was already over. Lucian lay in the dirt, defeated and exposed, his polished facade stripped away to reveal the brutish creature beneath. Brena stared at the scene, a cold clarity washing over her. She had been so entranced by the gilded cage that she hadn't seen the monster holding the key. The kind, gentle Beta was nothing more than a tyrant with better manners. As Lucian scrambled to his feet, his face smeared with dirt and humiliation, a profound calm settled over Brena. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. All that remained was a sharp, unyielding certainty. The world had tried to dictate her fate, first through a tyrant's command, then through a keeper's possessiveness. Now 2 alphas stood before her, one consumed by a rage she recognized all too well, the other burdened by regret she was only beginning to grasp. But this wasn't their moment, it was hers. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she stepped forward, placing herself firmly between them. The movement was a statement in itself, and both men fell silent, their attention snapping to her. She faced Lucian first, her gaze steady and unwavering. There was no anger in her voice, only the quiet finality of truth. "The kindness you showed me was a leash, Lucian," she said, her voice ringing with authority that stunned those watching. "You didn't want a mate. You wanted a beautiful bird for your cage. I will not be caged." She saw the flicker of shocked understanding in his eyes before it was swallowed once again by his sullen fury. She had seen the depths of his soul, and no words remained to bridge the silence between them. Without malice or dramatics, she turned her back on him, a quiet dismissal that carried more weight than any venomous parting shot. Her focus shifted then, landing fully on Drogo. She studied him, truly saw him for the first time, taking in every line etched into his face by regret and every shadow pooled within his eyes from years of penance. This man before her was not the tyrant who had once cast her out. He was someone else entirely, a figure emerging, broken yet resolute from the ruins of his own making. "You were a tyrant," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, each word deliberate as if carving truth into stone. It needed saying, this acknowledgement of what they both knew. A king who ruled with clenched fists because you didn't know how to rule with an open heart. As she spoke, she stepped closer, closing the gap between them until her hand lifted instinctively toward his weathered face. The gesture hung unfinished, suspended in the charged air between them. "A beast cannot change its nature," she continued, her gaze steady, unflinching. "But you have proven yourself more than a beast. You are a man who has learned that real strength lies not in domination, but in earning the right to be chosen." She stopped mere inches away, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating off him. Time itself seemed to pause, holding its breath as the world narrowed to just the two of them. "I rejected a tyrant," she declared, her voice ringing clear against the stillness. "I will not reject a king." Her words lingered, heavy and electrified, hanging like thunderclouds above them. Then, almost imperceptibly, she moved again, bridging the last fragment of space between them until the heat of his body pressed faintly against hers. Tilting her head upward, she met his eyes, which shimmered now with disbelief so raw it bordered on anguish. He had come here braced for rejection, resignation painted across his features, hatred, fear, even apathy. He'd steeled himself for all of it. What he hadn't prepared for was acceptance, not grace, not forgiveness, certainly not this. And yet here she stood, offering him absolution he knew he did not deserve. The sheer force of it left him immobilized, undone by the weight of her mercy. So it fell to her to act, breaking centuries of tradition with one bold motion. Ignoring protocol, defying expectation, Brena, the Omega, took the lead. Her hands rose steadily, fingers cool but sure as they cradled his face. Rising onto her toes, she tilted her head, baring the delicate curve of her neck. It wasn't submission, it was something far greater, an act of trust, freely given, layered with meaning deeper than obligation or duty. She offered herself not out of weakness, but as a testament to the man she believed he had become. The moment shattered whatever restraint still held Drogo together. A violent shudder coursed through him, racking his frame with emotion too vast to contain. With a low, guttural sound torn straight from the depths of his being, he bent toward her. There was no savagery in his claim, only reverence, a profound tenderness that transformed the act into something sacred. His teeth grazed her skin lightly, sealing their bond with a touch so gentle it felt like a prayer whispered against her flesh. As the claim settled between them, an invisible tide surged, an explosion of energy rippling outward, ancient and unstoppable. A radiant surge of golden light and warmth burst forth, enveloping the entire clearing. Every wolf, from the most dominant alpha to the humblest omega, felt its presence deep within their bones. This was no ordinary connection. It was a profound destiny fulfilled, like a fractured fragment of the world seamlessly restoring itself. The undeniable magic of the moment resonated powerfully, transcending the simplicity of any ceremony. What had once been a forced rejection transformed into a bond sealed by choice, evolving into something extraordinary and legendary. The journey back home was not that of a ruler and his conquest, but rather two equals walking side by side. Their conversations stretched for hours, crafting a new future as they traversed the long path to the Blood Moon Collective. Drogo listened intently as she recounted the terror and isolation of her exile, while she learned of the shadows and regrets that lingered in the halls of his castle. He did not demand her submission or ask her to be his queen. Instead, he expressed his need for her as an equal. A king who cannot listen is a king destined to fail, he admitted, his voice heavy with the burden of past errors. My strength means nothing without your wisdom, Brena. You will not trail behind me or exist in my shadow. You will rule alongside me. Their arrival at the citadel was met with astonishment. The pack had only known that their king had embarked on a mysterious penance. Witnessing his return with the very Omega he had banished, now a figure of legend in her own right, sent waves of disbelief rippling through the capital. They observed her walking beside him, her head held high, their hands intertwined. They saw how he regarded her, not with ownership, but with profound reverence. As the pair ascended the steps to the great hall, the lingering resonance of their unique bond filled the air. There were no challenges, only a gradual, collective awe dawning upon the pack. The Alpha, who had conquered his rage, had returned with the Omega, who had tamed his heart. Brena's return to the Blood Moon Collective marked not a subjugation, but an elevation. Together, she and Drogo redefined the foundations of their society. Her compassion softened his strength, while his authority amplified her convictions. A new council was formed, ensuring representation for every rank, even the Omegas, where voices could be heard without fear. Their reign embodied justice, fairness, and unity-driven strength rather than fear. Their story became a timeless legend passed down through generations. It was the tale of a tyrant king humbled not by war, but by a whisper. It was the story of an outcast Omega who discovered power not through submission, but defiance. It was the saga of how an unyielding, gentle heart forged the greatest king their people had ever known.